In all my years of travel and wandering about, I must admit, I've never gotten used to flying. It's not the flight itself, it's dealing with the airport and the uncertainty that drives me nuts. Once we're in the air, there's a reasonable amount of certainty that I'll get where I'm going, but you have to get through the airport first. Landing at Dulles Airport, never having been there before, I found navigating this massive port of entry to be quite simple. And before long I arrived at the nearby Westin Hotel where I would meet our tour guides and fellow travelers. That night we had a very nice meet and greet dinner, and it didn't take long to feel comfortable with this group. After months of planning and anticipation, I was ready for a great 9-day tour with Stephan Ambrose on this hallowed ground. In the morning we headed off to the Manassas National Battleground. The South called it Manassas because of the nearby town of Manassas, and the North called it Bull Run because of the stream that ran through the battleground. Now there was 2 battles at Manassas. The first was in July of 1861, which most considered the first large-scale battle of the Civil War. The second occurred in August of 1862, and both were Union defeats. Our first stop was at the National Park Service Visitor Center. It has a fair-sized museum with a lot of interpretive displays and artifacts, primarily attached to the first Bull Run. Now, one of the items that immediately attracted me is the cornerstone from the home of William McLean. He lived here with his family since 1853. When the first battle broke out, his home was taken over by the Confederates and used for the headquarters for General Beauregard. Now, General Beauregard was standing on a porch when a Union cannonball hit the house. He wasn't killed, but he was pretty much injured. Now, after the battle, Wilmer McLean moved his family to Appomattox Courthouse, where 4 years later, Lee surrendered to Grant, and Wilmer would quote that the war started on my porch and ended in my parlor. There's a number of uniforms on display here as well. The traditional image of the blue and the gray was a myth during the first Battle of Bull Run. There were very few uniforms for those 90-day enlistees. They wore uniforms of either their local militia or whatever they could muster up. And this created a lot of confusion on the battlefield, and undoubtedly a lot of friendly fire. The canteen and water was a primary necessity to the soldiers' personal gear that will resonate through our tour in a very human way, as we will see. There's a lot of beautiful Civil War art on display throughout our tour. Sidney King's capture of Ricketts Battery is a rare find. He was commissioned by the National Park Service to paint many of the battlefield maps. The works of Don Troiani and Dick Richardson cover the visitor center walls as great murals, and we'll see a lot more of them at the many national park sites that we visit. Now, we walked out to the home of the widow Judith Carter Henry and the site of the first major battle in 1861. We regrouped at each of the sites we visited, and Kyle, our tour historian, he would lay out the events that took place in a way that was understandable and not overburdened with academic detail, which was something I was really happy with. We were all given this beautiful road book that detailed each battlefield we visited, but you really needed a degree to figure out what was on these maps. But they made a lot more sense after Kyle gave us his lecture. Now, the widow Judith Carter This 85-year-old widow was bedridden and unable to leave the house when the Confederate sharpshooters occupied it. Union artillery destroyed the house, and Judith Carter became the battle's only civilian casualty. Now, after the war, her son John came back to find nothing left of their home. He constructed a new home on the site and soon realized that he could profit from all the veterans and curiosity seekers returning to the battlefield. So he opened a museum with all the artifacts he had collected on the battleground and offered tours that he carefully marked where the events happened. And some of these markers still survive around the site, and they help later historians retell the story of the battle. Here also is the Patriots Monument. It was erected by the veterans in 1865, and years later, in the 1940s, and when the National Park Service worked to restore the monument, they found that the shells were live. They replaced them with replicas, and we saw the old shells back at the visitor center. We then walked out to the Confederate battery line, enjoying the beauty of the landscape, but respectful of the fact that we were walking on hallowed ground and possibly on the graves of those soldiers never found. I became very interested in the various wayside markers on the battlefield. In the 1920s, this was known as the Manassas Battlefield Confederate Park. In 1936, the Sons of Confederate Veterans deeded the land to the National Park Service with the criteria that a huge statue of Stonewall Jackson be built and that the interpretive signage had to come from the School of the Lost Cause. It's a false version of U.S. history developed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy that portrays the white South as the victims. And that's what these yellow markers are. They're clearly marked CSA for the Confederate States and U.S. For the United States. Now, over the years, the National Park Service decided to tell a more accurate account as part of their Mission 66 project. And these new national park markers were placed on the battlefield. Most of these are adorned with paintings by Dick Richardson and Mark Mariotto. The statue to Stonewall Jackson is quite large and quite comical in a sense. Sculptor Joseph Paglia depicts him as a very buffed superhero, supposedly fashioned after Superman. The nature of the statue does not reflect the General Jackson of the Civil War, but rather it's seen through the cultural eyes of the 1930s and a hero of the Great Depression. We then took a picnic lunch break at the Stewart's Hill Administration Center. As we sat here enjoying our boxed lunch under the shade of the trees, I couldn't help but think about the first Battle of Bull Run, which, among other things, became known as the Picnic Battle. When 35,000 Union troops marched out of Washington to Manassas, they were followed by hordes of spectators who came to picnic and watched the battle as if it was a football game. At the time, everybody thought this would be a 90-day skirmish. Union and Confederate troops were green. They had great enthusiasm, but little training, and their command structure was no better. Once real bullets and shells started flying and men started dropping, the end of innocence was a quick wake-up call. The Confederate troops overtook the Union troops and forced them into a chaotic retreat. It was every man for himself. The battle then became known as the Great Skedaddle. At the bridge over Bull Run, retreating Union soldiers ran into retreating and panicked spectators as Confederate artillery pounded the ground around them. There were a lot of sketch artists that will follow us through all the battlefields that we visit. They primarily worked for the North or the South publications because the technology to print photos was not there yet. The War Department gave them access as special artists, and aside from their publishing duties, they also produced maps and landscape details that the commanders needed to form their battle strategies. Now, generally, the publishers would have additional artists embellish the sketches before the printing, and who would add patriotic details for the reader's assurance that everything was going good. Now, there's a lot of great and/or horrific stories that came out of this war. When discussing the First Battle of Bull Run, the story of Sullivan Ballou will usually come up. He's remembered for a letter that he wrote to his wife Sarah a week before he was mortally wounded in the First Battle of Bull Run. But his story is no different than thousands of other men and boys who wrote home, but maybe didn't make it home. Dear Sarah, I'm compelled to write with aching, fearful hands, just in case I never make it back. I left our family weeks ago for battle-stricken lands, and I fear I won't survive the next attack. I fled Rhode Island willingly to join a Union force, understanding I may never know my boys. This country's strength of government is in a great divorce, and for this I risk my life and all its joys. Oh Sarah, I do understand within my sacrifice, knows nearly every joy for you as well. I hope you sense within my words I thought about it twice, but our nation cast a thick momentous spell. Oh Sarah, start life without me, raise our boys to be gentlemen, and thrive until the day you pass away and we can meet again. Understand my inner fight, I didn't choose the war, I sided with democracy, yes, that is what I'm fighting for. Oh Sarah, my love for you is deathless. Oh Sarah, my love for you is deathless. Now, unfortunately, Sullivan's story didn't end with his death. He was buried in a temporary grave outside Sudley Church, which was used as a field hospital. And reckless Confederate forces who occupied the ground exhumed, decapitated, and burned his body. They exhumed Union bodies with the intent of boiling off the remaining skin and removing the bones as relics, souvenirs, trophies of war. Now, these scenes from Bull Run shattered the hope that the Civil War would be civil. After lunch, we headed to Brawner Farm, where the Second Battle of Bull Run began. The National Park Service has restored the farmhouse, and it is now an interpretive center. We were met by a ranger who gave us a very animated history of the Second Battle. There were a number of displays, but the air conditioning was an added bonus. We then went to the Stone House, which was used as a landmark, a headquarters, and a field hospital in both battles. It is a witness to the war, and there is a number of cannonballs still lodged in the walls. And we had a very informative tour on the history of the house. Upstairs there are two names carved in the woodwork, injured soldiers that lay among the many. 17-year-old Eugene Gear, recruited 3 months before the first battle. He died of his wounds a couple weeks later. And Private Charles Brehm, who survived his wounds. Outside the house is the first marker on the battlefield. It was placed here in 1925 by the Battlefield Marker Association and the Daughters of the Confederacy. It's one of 25 that was placed between here and Appomattox, designed to be read from an automobile. Most of them are gone now. Our last stop of the day was a walk down to the stone bridge over Bull Run. The bridge was of strategic importance to the Union as a way to move troops, artillery, and wagons across Bull Run to and from the battlefield. When Confederate troops left the area, they blew up the bridge. Now, battles were only part of the Civil War. What they left in their wake is another part that we tend to forget. The town of Centerville, just outside the battleground, was all but decimated by the war. After the first Bull Run, the Confederate Army set up a winter camp here. The effect of 30,000 troops camped for the winter in this small town was devastating. Every piece of timber was taken to build their huts and to provide firewood. Streams and water sources were unsafe, polluted, and diseases from the rotting corpses and unsanitary conditions spread through the camp and into the town. Nearly 5,000 soldiers were either killed, wounded, captured, or missing at the first battle in 1861. Now that rose to nearly 22,000 at the second battle of 1862. We had become a better killing machine by then. When the Confederates left the area in March of 1862, photographers George Bernard and James Gibson were able to take photos at the sites of the battle. They described the area as a desert. So after a long, hot day, we retreated back to our hotel at Dulles for dinner, to enjoy the company of our new friends, and to discuss the events of the day. In the morning, we headed off for Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Now, between 1861 and 1865, Harper's Ferry changed hands 8 times. It was a strategic location to both sides because of its access to the B&O Railroad and as a munitions center for the Union Army. Now, we first stopped at Bolivar Heights, where in September of 1862, Stonewall Jackson besieged the town and forced the surrender of some 13,000 Union troops. This was under the command of Dixon Miles, who was convicted of being drunk at the first battle of Bull Run. His subordinates were not too happy with his decision to surrender. They felt that they could fight it out and win. Now, a stray shell blast that took out Dixon Miles is said to have been friendly fire by his enraged troops. So we walked the Bolivar Heights battlefield, learned about the battle, and enjoyed the beautiful surroundings before heading into town. Now, the most well-known story at Harper's Ferry is that of John Brown's raid in October of 1859. In order to secure rifles from the armory for his abolitionist group of raiders. Well, that didn't work out well for him. As he held up in what is now called John Brown's fort, they were captured and John Brown was later hanged for his crimes, and even today some people see him as a martyr, while others simply just a mad criminal. Now the fort itself, which at the time was a firehouse, has a pretty interesting story. After the war it became a tourist destination, primarily for blacks, which the town folk didn't particularly like. In 1891 it was sold, dismantled, and moved to the World's Fair up in Chicago, where it received little attention. So it was dismantled again and left in a vacant lot. In 1895 it returned to Harper's Ferry, where it was rebuilt and moved twice again. Finally, in 1968, the National Park Service moved it back into town to where it sits today. The point where the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers meet is a beautiful spot. Here you can see the new railroad bridge and the remains of the old B&O railroad bridge that the Confederates destroyed when they left town. So here we see 5 of the 217 iron tablets placed here by the War Department in 1890. The balance were placed at Antietam, which we'll see later. Now they offer a lot of detailed reading, but when the National Park Service took over, they developed a more visitor-friendly markers, the ones that we see today. John Brown's fort, where it sits today, is not where it originally sat. When the railroad was rebuilt, they built these embankments over the original site. Now there's a monument here where it used to sit, and it's cool to look at an old picture and how it lines up with the buildings in the back by looking at the chimneys. Below the embankment is where the armory used to be, which had provided more than 600,000 rifles and muskets in a 60-year period. So you can see why it was an attractive objective for the Confederacy. Learning of this, in April '61, the Union forces in town set torches to the armory in an attempt to keep the arms-making material out of the Confederate hands. Now they didn't do a very good job of this, and local townfolk worked to put out the flames because the armory was their only reason for living in Harper's Ferry. And once the Confederates occupied the town, they made off with a large quantity of machinery and all the other Union stockpiles. Once again, the Confederate forces left, and the Union forces returned. Noted Civil War photographer Matthew Brady came along with them and to document the carnage. Now, Brady was a quirky character. Although he is attributed to much of the Civil War photography, it was actually his staff that took most of the battlefield pictures. And as we'll learn, many of those photos were staged to some degree. And he liked to sneak into many of the photos. And in this photo here of the ruins of the armory, he's there in the background. He became the Where's Waldo of Civil War photography. During the occupation, this area became a contraband camp, which were escaped slaves who were Southern property. With the railroad bridge now destroyed, the Union engineers built a pontoon bridge across the Potomac. It breached this massive stone wall that was built to hold back the Potomac when it flooded. There's a display in town that shows how deep that flooding got over the years. I was intent to go down a small path to where the pontoon bridge was and to check out the flood wall. The original iron rings that anchored the pontoon bridge were still in place, and I thought the wall itself was pretty impressive. I then wandered up to the train station, which is now Amtrak and runs between Washington and Chicago. They have a small gallery in the old train station where I found this sketch of Hayward Shepard, the first man to die in John Brown's raid. Now, Hayward was a baggage handler here at the old B&O station. Ironically, he was a free black man. and he was shot by two of John Brown's raiders as they entered town. Harper's Ferry is a great place to visit. There's plenty of shops, cafes, and museums to keep you busy. I made a beeline for the ice cream shop. The armory is gone, but the Industry Museum is a great place to learn about the machinery that changed the rifle-making process from handmade to mechanical, and why this was so important for the Confederates to seize. And of course, there are ghost tours. One of the most commonly spotted ghosts is Dangerfield Newby. He was one of the men that was involved in John Brown's failed raid, and he was killed in the skirmish. The angry town people left his body in this alley for the hogs to eat, and apparently he still walks the streets at night. After lunch, we headed off to the Antietam National Battlefield in Sharpsburg, Maryland. On September 17, 1862, Antietam saw the deadliest one-day battle in military history, with nearly 23,000 casualties. Now, there was no strategic gain here for either the North or the South. It was simply a killing field. Unfortunately, the artifacts in the Visitor Center Museum were removed due to water leaks, so that was kind of disappointing. There was still a number of displays to view, but overall it was disappointing. I thought this artifact pyramid was interesting. It's composed of artifacts found by veterans, collectors, and would-be artists, to make a quick buck, of course. This one here was created by Oliver Riley. Remember that name. And we'll see more of these once we get to Gettysburg. Fortunately, the Elliott map, reproduction of, was still here on display. This was only found in 2020, stashed away in the New York Historical Society. In the days after the battle, the dead were buried where they fell. Two men, Aaron Good and John Gill, using years of research, went about identifying the graves and the burial locations. 2 years after the battle, they drafted a map that marked over 5,800 graves of Union and Confederate soldiers. It was this map that assisted the grisly task of removing the remains from the field to the newly established National Cemetery in 1866. Unfortunately, there was only one of artist John Hope's massive murals on display here. He spent years researching the battle and interviewing veterans to create a series of 6 murals that were accurate in every detail. This one here is showing the battle outside the Dunkers Church. He was a captain in the 2nd Marine Infantry, injured at Antietam, painting his murals at his studio in Watkins Glen, New York, and they were damaged in a flood in the 1930s, to be found rotting in the eaves of a church many years later. The National Park Service purchased them and restored them in 1979. These murals were like 5.5 by 12 feet, and they weighed like 200 pounds. Across the street from the visitor center is a small monument to Oliver Riley, of the Relic Pyramid fame. He was 5 years old at the time of the battle, and he watched from a nearby hilltop. After the battle, he went about collecting relics and talking to veterans and survivors, eventually starting the first guided tour service, museum, and gift shop, and selling relic pyramids, of course. He was a smart kid. We then took a walk out to the Maryland Monument, stopping at a few others along the way. Now, the Maryland Monument is the only monument dedicated to both the Union and the Confederate troops. Maryland was kind of a mugwump state. It had its mug in the north, but its wump remained in the south. I was impressed with the artistry and the detail on these bas-relief plates, on this and many of the other monuments we visited. They were really beautiful. Now here too are some of the 217 steel markers placed by the War Department in the 1890s. When the National Park Service took over in 1957, they restored them rather than replace them. We then went on to visit the Dunker Church, so named because its congregation would get baptized by dunking in a nearby Antietam Creek. The church was the epicenter of some of the hardest fighting at Antietam. During and after the battle, the church was used as a temporary medical station. Now, this sketch by Alfred Wade depicts a truce between the opposing sides in order to exchange the wounded and bury the dead. It was described by veterans as Hell's Waiting Room. There was a song, it is said, that Confederate troops would sing as they marched past the Union injured and dying on the hospital grounds. It was kind of a jab at their defeat. But another account said that it was also a song that wounded Confederates would sing to themselves as they were carried to the hospital. It's called Somebody's Darling, and to them it meant somebody wasn't going home that night. The clean whitewashed halls where the dead slept and the dying lay, wounded by bayonets, sabers and balls. Somebody's darling was born one day. Somebody's darling, so young and so brave, wearing still on his sweet yet pale face, soon to be hid in the dust of the grave, the lingering light of his boyhood grace. Somebody's darling, somebody's pride, who'll tell his mother, well, her boy died. Who'll tell his mother, well, her boy died. The church survived the battle, but it was destroyed by a storm in 1921. A man named Elmer Boyer collected all the church debris and stored it all in his barn. The site soon became the home for Poffenberger's Lunchroom, catering to battlefield tourists at that time. When the National Park Service took over in 1962, they purchased the debris from Boyer and restored the church using as much of the original material as was left. Now here we can see what the church looked like after a restoration in 1973, and what it looks like now after the National Park Service and the American Battlefield Trust purchased and restored the land around it to look as it did in 1862. I'm not sure why I found our group sitting inside the church, possibly for a moment of quiet reflection. There was not much to see here, and it certainly wasn't air-conditioned. From here we went on to walk the Sunken Road, or Bloody Lane as it became known. Along with the cornfield, this was the site of one of the bloodiest encounters in the whole Civil War. After 3 hours of brutal combat, 5,500 men were killed or wounded here. Before the National Park Service took over, of course there used to be a souvenir shop here, catering to the many tourists who were now coming to the park. Have to have a souvenir shop, right? Two days after the battle, photographer Alexander Gardner and James Gibson took to photograph the battlefield. Now this was the first time an American battlefield had ever been photographed before the dead were buried. And he posted these pictures in Matthew Brady's gallery up in New York City, and they were the first opportunity for the public to see the horrible, bloody truth of the Civil War. It was a horrific wake-up call.
'Twas on the field of Antietam where many's a soldier fell. Is where occurred the story which now to you I'll tell. The dead lay all around me, we all together lay, for we had had a fearful fight upon the field that day. And while I lay there musing upon the cold damp ground, my knapsack for a pillow, my blankets wrapped around, and while I lay there musing, I heard a bitter cry. It was, Lord Jesus, save me, and take me home to die.
So then we took a walk down to the Burnside Bridge, stopping to talk at the memorial for William McKinley, later to become President McKinley. At 19 years old, he was a commissary sergeant, remembered for his courageous actions delivering coffee, water, and hot meals to hundreds of tired and hungry men who were waiting reinforcements once they managed to get over the bridge. It's hard to see, but he is actually on the bas-relief embedded on the monument. Now the bridge was the scene of another bloody battle as Union General Ambrose Burnside pushed across the bridge and turned the Confederate right flank. After a long bloody battle, he succeeded with nearly 600 casualties, but the Confederates were already on retreat from Antietam. Now there's a witness tree here next to the bridge. You can see it in this original photograph by Alexander Gardner. And there's a number of monuments here as well. The stone wall here is the scene of another classic Gardner photo. It shows several temporary graves at the base of the wall. One of only 4 was identified as Edward Miller. Our last stop at Antietam was the National Cemetery, where the private soldier monument looks over the graves of 4,776 Union soldiers, about 1/3 of which are unknown, remembered only as a number. Off in the corner is a depression in the ground where there was once a large boulder. It was known as Lee's Rock, supposedly where General Lee stood and addressed his men before the battle. Well, that didn't sit right with the Memorial Commission, having a Confederate tourist attraction in a Union cemetery. Relic hunters would come to the site and actually break off pieces of the rock to take home as souvenirs. So the boulder was removed and crushed at an anonymous site. Now, like Centerville by Manassas, the small farming community of Sharpsburg was devastated for years after the battle. This sketch by Alfred Wade shows the townfolk fleeing before the battle. After the battle, some 75,000 Union troops camped around the town for nearly 2 months, consuming all the local resources, burying the dead, and dealing with the stench, pollution, and disease that was left on the battlefield. Among the rotting corpses, most people forget about the horse. 269 horses were killed during the battle at Antietam, and they estimate 1.5 million died during the Civil War.
Well, I thought the boy who shot me had a familiar face, but in the battle's fury 'twas difficult to trace. I thought it was my brother Jay, if him I could but see. I'd kiss him and forgive him and lay me down to die. Well, I quickly ran unto him and heard his story o'er. It was my long-lost brother who lay weltering in his gore. I spoke of loved ones left behind and soothed his fevered brow. And he whispered, my dear brother, I can die happy now. Then quickly, like a slumbering babe, his fluttering eyelids closed. I watched him sink with shortening breath to death's long last repose. So with many's the tear and sad farewell, I scooped a narrow grave, and now he sleeps beneath the sod by Antietam's rippling waves.
So now we end our day at our home for the next 3 nights in Gettysburg, PA. Here we had a great dinner and an open bar and a relaxed conversation with our new friends. The hotel was right in the middle of downtown, and there was plenty of ice cream shops around. In the morning, we took a walk across town to see the Shriver House and Museum. We were met by a very feisty Dawson who would guide us through the civilian experience, what it was like for those who lived in Gettysburg during the battle. As we walked around the house, we saw many bullet holes in the brick walls. Inside, you got a good look at how the Shriver family lived at the time the war broke out. It was pretty simple fare, but probably a lot better than most folks at the time. We walked up to the attic where the Confederate sharpshooters perched after they invaded the homes. The walls were covered with bullet holes, but they're all sealed now. There's a couple of rooms that are supposed to show the mess left behind, but I don't know, I've seen worse at home. The basement was a saloon and a bowling alley. This is where the residents sheltered during the occupation. There's a small display area with a few Shriver family artifacts. bought the house, they found this child's shoe buried in the wall. Apparently something people used to do to bring good luck. We then drove out to the park and picked up a Stephan guide. Park tours are required to have a National Park Service registered guide, and there's 130 of them at Gettysburg. The requirements for their training and registration are quite stringent. Now there's over 1,400 monuments in Gettysburg Park. We didn't do much monument hopping, and unfortunately some of the prime locations, like Little Round Top, were closed as the National Park Service was restoring them from years of tourist traffic. John Batchelder was an artist from New Hampshire with a passion for painting the Civil War battlefields. He arrived in Gettysburg 2 days after the battle and spent years sketching the battlefield and interviewing locals and veterans on the field and in the hospitals. By 1870, he had created this massive isometric map of the battlefield, but it wasn't his art that made him the godfather of Gettysburg. In the process, he had become a historian as well, and soon published the first guidebook. In the 1880s, he joined the Gettysburg Battlefield Monument Association and soon became the superintendent of tablets and legends. With over 1,400 monuments in the park, there had to be guidelines to placements and content, or it would become chaos. He drew up and managed the rules and requirements for monument placement. Where they were placed was historical accuracy, and what content was to be displayed. The War Department tablets were designed by his historical information. The Union plaques had a square base, whereas the Confederate plaques had a round base. Monuments with a statue must face the field of action. The state seal and the Corps' symbol must be displayed, even down to the size of the lettering. Although we had plenty of time to explore the places we stopped, we were not on a monument tour. We then returned to the visitor center for lunch and all the other features in this great location. There's a massive museum here that covers just about everything: Gettysburg, the Civil War, and the soldier's life. The canteen was one of those things that grabbed my interest throughout this whole trip. Here we have John Cook's canteen, which will figure into one of those great human stories that we'll learn about later on. From the museum, we sat through an excellent film entitled A New Birth of Freedom, narrated by Morgan Freeman. And then it's on to the cyclorama, the highlight of the visitor center. This 377-foot long, 42-foot high, weighing 12.5 tons painting was created by French artist Paul-Philippe Pétot in 1882 with a team of artists. He hired local photographer William Tipton to photograph a 360-degree view of the battlefield, and Tipton erected a platform near the copse of trees and took 30 photos, which were used to accurately portray the battlefield. It was first displayed in Chicago in 1883 and moved around to Boston, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn, New York before it was purchased by a local entrepreneur and found its way to Gettysburg. Opened to the public in 1913 and remained there for 40 years, sustaining a lot of damage in the process. I found this interesting ad for the Gettysburg Cyclorama, stating the cannoneer John Chase as being the lecturer and general manager. Now, John Chase was injured at the Battle of Gettysburg by a cannon shell, where he lost an arm, an eye, and suffered 48 shrapnel wounds. Thought to be dead, he was loaded onto a burial wagon. Luckily, the wagon driver heard some moans, and he was saved from an even worse fate. Apparently, he traveled with the cyclorama as a first-person narrator, and may have been responsible for it having been up for sale. I like the way they seem to have added his wounds to this picture. It's pretty funny. The National Park Service purchased the painting in 1942 and underwent a massive restoration process, reopening it to the public in 1962. In 2003, it underwent a $13 million rehabilitation. It was moved to the new visitor center where it sits now and was again unveiled to the public in 2008. Long story on this thing. The stories behind this painting are as fascinating as the painting itself.
Waited for the word, never came. Retreat from Gettysburg. I've seen a lot of wicked things, heard a lot of people cry. I know it couldn't touch the pain of seeing 50,000 die. I saw the sun fall away, the moon shone white on their graves. Down in Gettysburg, saw them all, bloody Gettysburg, took them all, waited for the word, never came. Retreat from Gettysburg. Billy Yank said goodbye. My mother and son left to die. Dixieland, look away. Our mother and son died today.
then made a stop at the Seminary Ridge Museum, which is part of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. Now they have 4 floors of exhibits here, with a few artifacts. Shoes, the mythical reason Lee came to Gettysburg, is on display as well. I was more interested in a set of murals by Civil War artist Dale Gallen. Now the 3rd floor depicted the building as it was used as a field hospital during the battle. Interesting, but the place had an obvious agenda. The 1st and 2nd floors were political and religious, which I didn't find that interesting. On the way to dinner, we had time to visit the Civil War Tales Diorama Museum. We had seen many dioramas on our trip so far, but these were different. They were all cats, over 10,000 of them. I kind of thought they reminded me of Gumby. There were also several Dale Gallen paintings here to see. It was fun and a lighthearted way to end a long day. Dinner was at the Hoof, Fin and Fowl, and it was excellent. The next morning we visited Coon's Brickyard, the site of one of the first battles at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, where Custer's Union Brigade met Confederate General Hay's Brigade. It was a nasty Confederate victory with nearly 800 casualties on both sides. Now we learned about the battle and a few monuments that were here. The highlight being a massive mural by Mark Dunkelman depicting the battle in graphic detail. Now the mural has a glass cover. It was hard to capture without all the glare, and I thought it was pretty cool that our reflections made it look like we were in the battle. The main event of our day would be the walking of Pickett's Charge, the decisive battle at the Gettysburg Campaign, and some say the Civil War itself, which resulted in 6,500 Confederate casualties in less than an hour of fighting. We started our walk at the Virginia Monument, facing the battlefield. It was designed by artist William Seaver. It is topped by General Lee and his horse Traveler. Seaver wanted to memorialize all of those who dedicated their lives to the Confederate Army. He wanted to shift the focus from the military generals to the lower-ranking soldiers. Our walk would be about 1 mile across the battlefield, stopping at various points as we learned about the events and the terrain. Our path was cut and easy to traverse, but that wasn't the case for the exhausted Confederate troops as they marched towards their inevitable slaughter in the July heat. Our destination was a small patch of trees, now called the Copse of Trees, on the Confederate high water mark, where the Union lines were spread. As beautiful as these fields appear to us today, I'm reminded of what poet Walt Whitman had to say as he looked across the field after the battle, and how we are in fact walking on hallowed ground. We came off the field at the Angle, a spot where some Confederate forces did make a short-lived breakthrough. We see the monument here to General George Meade, riding his horse, Old Baldy. He's looking across the field at the statue of Lee. The monument in front of it marks the closest the Confederates got to the Union line. This is one of the more popular spots in the park, and there's half a day's worth of monument hopping you could do just here alone. In front of the Copse of Trees is the high water mark of the Rebellion Monument, to honor the commands of both armies that participated in the battle. The monument was designed by John Batchelder. The copse of trees had to be fenced in because relic hunters would chop the trees for souvenirs to a point where they nearly disappeared. There's a lot of depth and artistry and symbolism that went into these monuments, but time was a factor, and there was only as much as we could get to. One of the oddball things on my checklist was to find the spot where Frederick Tipton built his platform to take pictures for the cyclorama. It's said to have been near the 72nd Pennsylvania monument, which I did find. Now the platform was 10 feet high, and Tipton took 30 pictures from 10 angles for a 360-degree view. Each angle consisted of 3 shots. One of the distant landscape, one view at eye level, and one of the foreground. The 10 eye-level photographs are the only ones known to exist today. The other 20 are a relic hunter's holy grail, if they even exist. I tried to match up one of the photos, but the terrain and my ground level vantage point was not the same. Our last stop within the park was at the National Cemetery, the final resting place for more than 3,500 Union troops killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. 979 of these are unknown. The Soldiers' National Monument is here, honoring the battle's soldiers, alleging peace and plenty under freedom, following a heroic struggle. It seemed an appropriate place to end our tour of the battlefield. We had an afternoon to explore Gettysburg on our own, which I found to be a Civil War Disneyland. I wanted to spend some time in the Gettysburg Museum of History, where I ended up spending half the afternoon, because there's so much to see here. It's a relic hunter's heaven, and not just a museum, but it's a business where collectors can buy and sell their relics. Of course, there's a lot of Civil War artifacts here. There's even another relic pyramid, and a number of war logs. But there are several rooms filled with World War I and World War II artifacts as well. Lots of oddball stuff like mummified and shrunken heads. I enjoyed the Kennedy collection. I had forgotten that John F. Kennedy used to smoke. And who could resist Marilyn Monroe's bra? The assassination cabinet had some interesting things, like the .38 caliber shell casing from Jack Ruby's gun, down to Lee Harvey's doorknob. And of course there's the mandatory gift shop. Now Gettysburg is a great place to walk around and people watch. It has more ghost tours than any other place in America. That night we went to the Dobbin House for dinner. Built in 1776, it has little to do with the Civil War, but it was cool, comfortable, and the food was excellent. So we said goodnight to Gettysburg, having touched on a small bit of it, but having been touched to a greater degree.